On the evening of Wednesday, March 26, 2003, a 55-year-old woman named Linda Myers drove down a secluded two-lane road in Darke County, Ohio. Darke County was very rural. It was basically just very small towns and farmland. And so as Linda drove down the road, kind of in the middle of nowhere, she looked out her window and she saw the sun setting over a field. She was coming home from the pizza shop that she and her husband Jack owned in a town nearby. Linda eventually turned down a gravel road and onto the sprawling 40-acre farm where she and her husband lived. She parked outside their old farmhouse, and then she grabbed a deposit bag with money from the pizza shop out of the back seat, and then she got out of her car. Their farm was so isolated that she couldn't hear any cars on the road or anything from the neighbors' houses, so it was completely quiet except for the sheep that were bleating in the field and the occasional sound of power tools coming from the barn. She walked around to the back of the barn, and she found Jack hunched over the engine of a beat-up old car. The two of them had been married for about 7 years, and even though this was actually Linda's third marriage, she really felt like Jack was her soulmate. In addition to owning the shop with Linda, the pizza shop, Jack also had a full-time job at a manufacturing plant, and he also had a side business restoring cars. And so Linda often found him out here behind the barn working on a car around the time the sun was going down. And sitting in the grass beside the car, playing with a wrench, was Linda's 4-year-old great-grandson, Damien. And the second Damien saw Linda, he smiled and he got up and he rushed over to her to give her a big hug. And Damien's smile made Linda feel sort of bittersweet. Damien was the son of Linda's granddaughter, Amber. But Amber had gotten pregnant at just 14 years old, and so as a result had not been in any position to take care of a baby. So Linda and Jack had offered to take Damien in and raise him for a few years while Amber finished high school and got on her feet. However, this was definitely not a perfect arrangement for many reasons, but one of those reasons was because Damien's father was furious about being cut out of the custody agreement. Even now, 4 years after, Damien's situation had been decided, the father still argued with Linda about how she wouldn't let him see his son. But Linda felt like as much as he was saying he wanted to be in Damien's life, she felt like at some point he was going to abandon this child, and so she really didn't want him to be around Damien at all. She didn't want her great-grandson to be abandoned like that. And besides, Damien would have another father figure in his life soon enough, because in the past few years, Amber had finished school, she had met a new man, and gotten married. And as soon as Damien finished up this year of preschool in a couple of months, Amber and her new husband were planning to take him in and raise him on their own. Linda was proud of Amber, how she had turned her life around, but she also felt a little sad, bittersweet, because she and Jack were going to miss having Damien around. They loved him. He was basically their son. Linda knew that Jack clearly was busy with this car and kind of didn't want to be interrupted. So she just said a quick hello and then scooped Damien up and carried him over to the farmhouse. She opened up the door and she set him down and told him to go wash up before dinner. Then she went into the kitchen and she dropped the deposit bag from the pizza shop into a chair in the dining room. The bag was full of cash, and her plan was to drop it off at the bank in the morning. Linda got out a pan and began cooking dinner, and pretty soon her husband Jack came inside, covered in car grease. While Jack washed his hands at the kitchen sink, Linda asked him about his day. And Jack kind of grumbled about this customer that he had sold a car to on a payment plan the previous year, who had now missed 3 payments in a row. Jack said he was going to have to drive out there to the person's house tomorrow and repossess the car. Linda could see, Jack is obviously pretty tense here, but Linda knew it wasn't really that missed car payment that was bothering him. The truth was, Jack had been sort of tense really for the past week, ever since he had had this big argument with his 25-year-old son, Greg. Greg had always been very shy and mild-mannered and really close with his dad. In fact, he was the best man at Jack and Linda's wedding. But recently, Greg's life had been falling off the rails. He was in the middle of a divorce, he was struggling with drinking and drug abuse, and he'd been missing shifts at work. And so earlier that month, he had come by to ask Jack for money because his house was about to be foreclosed on. And Jack had drawn a line and said no. He told Greg that if he wanted to keep his house, he'd have to clean up his act and get back to work. And so that had led to a very big fight. And so now Linda had a feeling that Jack was genuinely worried that he'd done real damage to his relationship with Greg, perhaps irreparably, because something pretty similar had also happened with Jack's other son, Travis. About 7 years earlier, when Travis was 21, he and Jack had gotten into this big argument that was so bad, Travis moved out, and then the two of them had not spoken since for 7 years. So Linda thought Jack must be worried that that would be the same thing that would happen with him and Greg. So while Jack washed his hands, Linda rubbed his shoulders and told him not to worry about Greg. He had a good head on his shoulders, and he just needed a little nudge to get back on track, and that's all Jack had done. She reassured him that he'd made the right call and Greg would get through this rough patch sooner or later. Then Linda set the table and called the family to dinner. A little while later, after they'd eaten and cleaned up, Linda looked up at the clock and realized it was getting kind of late. Damien had preschool in the morning, and she didn't want him to be tired and grumpy. So she scooped him up and took him to his room upstairs to get ready for bed. She helped him change into his PJs, she brushed his teeth, then tucked him in, gave him a kiss goodnight, and closed the door. Linda went back downstairs, and before long, she and Jack were getting ready for bed too. Before long, Linda was in her bedroom, she had turned on a lamp, she had changed into her PJs and crawled under the covers. And then once Jack was settled in next to her, she turned off the light, and they fell asleep. But several hours later, Linda was suddenly woken up by this horribly loud noise, and she sat up and looked around, and when her eyes finally adjusted to the darkness, she gasped. The next morning, at a church a mile away from Linda and Jack's house, a preschool teacher was getting ready to start class, but she noticed there was an empty chair in her classroom. One of her students, 4-year-old Damien Huffman, was late. She knew Damien's great-grandparents led busy lives and had several different jobs and businesses, so she figured they must just be running late. So she began class and hoped they would just drop Damien off before he missed too much. And about an hour later, at 9:30 a.m., she was leading the class in morning sing-alongs when Damien suddenly came sprinting into the classroom. Now, at first, the teacher was relieved that Damien had shown up, but then she realized Damien looked frazzled and out of breath, and he didn't have his backpack, and he was wearing PJs, and there was the smear of something brown on his shirt. She ran over to him and knelt down next to him and realized the brown spot was dried blood. The teacher asked Damien what was going on, and he looked at her with this scared, confused expression, and he told her his great-grandparents' faces were melting. About 15 minutes later, a police sergeant named Mark Whitaker, along with his partner, drove down a secluded road toward a farmhouse in rural Ohio. Sergeant Whitaker had been a detective for the Darke County Sheriff's Department for 5 years, and he was in charge of the investigative unit. So when the department had gotten a very strange 911 call that morning from a local preschool, he was sent out to investigate. According to the preschool teacher, a 4-year-old student named Damien Huffman had come into school covered in blood, out of breath, saying something about his great-grandparents' faces being, melting. The teacher identified the great-grandparents as Linda and Jack Myers. Now, Whitaker had no idea what Damien meant when he had said that their faces were melting, or what kind of situation, Whitaker and his partner would be walking into when they got to the farm. But he had a feeling it would not be good. They pulled up to the farm and parked at the end of the long gravel road. And when Whitaker got out of his car, he immediately noticed how eerily quiet it was. There was another farmhouse just across the road and a few more on the horizon, but otherwise they were surrounded by empty fields in every direction. Whitaker began walking towards the front door when he saw the front door was already wide open, but there was no clear sign of forced entry. But nonetheless, Whitaker and his partner reflexively drew their weapons and they stepped inside the house. Whitaker began calling out to see if anybody was home, but there was no response. From where he was standing, he saw there was another open door in the house that led to a set of stairs that went down presumably to the basement. Whitaker ignored the basement for now and instead continued clearing the first floor. So he went into the kitchen, and once he was sure it was clear, he continued down the hallway until he found a doorway that led into a bedroom. And when he went inside that bedroom, he found Damien's great-grandparents, Jack and Linda Myers. And they were lying in their bed, side by side, and he could tell immediately they were both dead. Now, Jack was actually lying on his stomach, and he could tell right away there was a big bullet wound on the back of Jack's neck. As for Linda, she was on her back, and she had gunshot wounds to her face and her hand, as if she had raised her hand to defend herself before she was shot. And so at this point, Whitaker and his partner did a full search of the house just to make sure nobody else was there, and it was empty. And so the two went back to the bedroom to begin investigating the bodies. Whitaker put on a pair of latex gloves and touched the wound on Linda's face. and the blood was still warm and wet, so he figured likely they'd only been dead for maybe a few hours at most. He looked around the floor, and he didn't see any bullet casings, which meant the killer had gone through the trouble of picking them up afterwards to cover their tracks. Then, Whitaker's partner called his attention to this weird plasticky bundle that was lying on a pillow near Jack's head. Whitaker picked it up, and he saw it was a piece of quilting fabric that was balled up and covered in masking tape. His best guess was that it was a homemade gun silencer. The killer likely taped it to the end of their gun to muffle the sound of the blast, and it must have, blown off at some point when they actually began shooting. Immediately, Whitaker wondered if this was a silencer, why the killer would need one so far out in the middle of nowhere. But when Whitaker left the bedroom and went up a flight of stairs to the room right above where the murders had taken place, he found another bedroom that was full of stuffed animals and toy trucks. It was obviously Damien's room. And it was at this point that Whitaker realized, very likely the killer must have known there was going to be a toddler sleeping right upstairs when they did this, and so they needed the silencer in order to not wake the child when they committed this murder. And so this meant that the killer almost certainly knew Jack and Linda personally. Within minutes, more officers from the Darke County Sheriff's Office swarmed the property. Whitaker went outside to supervise them, and pretty quickly, a forensics officer called him over to look at a set of footprints that they had found in the mud. Whitaker followed the trail of footprints around the side of the house to a basement window. The window pane had been pried off, leaving an open hole that was just big enough for a person to squeeze through. Whitaker crouched down and looked through the open space, and he could see inside there was a set of stairs leading up to the main part of the house. And so he realized this must have been how the killer got inside. And it was also why, when they had first gone inside, that they had seen the door to the basement standing wide open. And so this only made Whitaker more sure that this crime had to have been committed by somebody close to this couple, because the killer obviously knew the layout of Linda and Jack's house. Whitaker told the forensics officer to make a cast of the footprints so they could figure out what type and size of shoe the killer was wearing. And then as Whitaker stood back up, he noticed something else. The phone lines that were running along the side of the house had clearly been severed. The killer clearly had planned ahead and made sure that nobody in this house could call for help. Just then, a truck pulled up at the end of the road, and a woman got out and started walking toward the house. Whitaker quickly went over to stop her from getting too close to the crime scene, and he asked her what she needed. And she said she was a neighbor who lived at the next property over. She said that she had seen the police cars coming down the road and she didn't really know what was going on, but she felt like she had information that they might want. The neighbor said that around 4:30 that morning, she'd seen a minivan leaving the Myers farm. It had been so dark that she hadn't been able to see what color it was, but it had stuck out to her because as far as she knew, the Myers did not own a minivan. And so hearing this, Whitaker realized, this woman may have seen the killer leaving the property. And if that was true, it meant the murders most likely happened before 4:30 in the morning. And so this was potentially quite useful. And so he thanked the neighbor, and after she left, he went back inside the house to look for more clues. He really wanted to piece together a motive. He felt strongly that whoever had done this knew Linda and Jack, but that doesn't mean that the motive is clear. There could be any number of reasons they would attack them. Maybe it was a robbery. Maybe they were just, getting revenge or something. He didn't know, but as he began walking around the house, he found a literal deposit bag full of cash in the living room, which certainly suggested that this was not a robbery, because that would certainly have been taken. And also there were some pretty expensive electronics in the living room that also had not been touched, so robbery seemed to be out the door. But when Whitaker went back upstairs to take a closer look at the toddler's bedroom, he noticed something odd. There was a little red stain on the bedding that looked like dried blood. While forensics teams were still combing over the farmhouse, another investigator assigned to the case, a guy named Detective Mike Burns, went to the local preschool to speak to 4-year-old Damien. Burns was a father himself, and he felt an immediate connection to this little boy, who at this point looked scared and very confused. Now, he knew it was going to be very difficult for Damien to rehash something that was so traumatic, but Damien was the only potential witness in the house when his great-grandparents were killed. So speaking to him was the police's best bet at figuring out what happened. And so Burns sat down on the floor with Damien inside of a private room, and he asked him to explain what had happened that morning. Damien, in a 4-year-old way, said he'd woken up around 8:45 and the house had been very quiet, so he'd gotten out of bed and went into his great-grandparents' bedroom. And then he said that both of them had been in bed, and he thought they were sleeping. But when he tried to wake them up, they wouldn't move. And then he realized there was blood on their face, and he said he had tried to wipe the blood off with Kleenex wipes. But there was so much of it that he realized something was very wrong. He thought for a second that their faces were melting. And so, to save his great-grandparents, he had run the full mile down the road to his preschool to get help. Burns was surprised that this 4-year-old could remember and articulate so much about such an awful experience. But he was very grateful because the child's story explained why there was blood on Damien's shirt. However, it did not explain why they'd also found blood on Damien's bed. So he asked Damien if he had gone back into his own room after finding his great-grandparents. But Damien said no. He'd gone straight out the front door and gone to his school. Burns thought there had to be more to the story, though, because otherwise he just couldn't explain how blood wound up in Damien's room. So he brought over a dollhouse, and he asked Damien to go ahead and act out everything that had happened the night before, using toys to represent himself and his great-grandparents. Damien put the toy that represented himself into bed in one room, and then he put Jack and Linda into the bed in the other room. And he said everybody went to sleep at their normal bedtimes. But later, in the middle of the night, he heard his bedroom door open, and he said somebody came inside. Burns asked Damien who it was. And Damien paused, and then he said, "The green monster." At first, Burns wasn't really sure what to make of this. He wondered if Damien was just imagining things or describing a nightmare or something. But then Damien set the toys down, and then to represent this green monster, he used his fingers to crawl across the floor of the dollhouse toward Damien's bed. Damien said he had heard the door open in his room and he had opened his eyes just a little bit, but he didn't want to give away that he was fully awake, so he was just squinting his eyes. And he said when he did that, he saw the green monster right next to his bed. And the green monster was pointing a gun at him. And Damien was so terrified, he said he shut his eyes and just pretended to be asleep. And then he said when he opened his eyes again, the green monster was gone. After hearing this, Burns realized that Damien's recollection was almost certainly not a dream. More likely than not, Damien had come face to face with his grandparents' killer. They were the green monster. After leaving the preschool, the next priority for Detective Burns was to speak to Damien's mother, 19-year-old Amber Holscher. And so the detective drove out to Amber's house, which was in a nearby town, and when he rang the doorbell, she answered right away. Now, at this point, nobody in the family had been notified yet about the murders, so Amber seemed to have no idea why a detective was now standing on her doorstep. Now, Burns knew this, and so he said to her, "Can I please come inside? We need to speak." And so, confused, Amber said okay, and she let him inside, and they sat down in the living room. And then Burns said to her, very gently, that her grandparents, Linda and Jack Myers, were no longer with them. But when Amber heard this, she just looked confused and asked what he meant, like, where are they? So Burns took a deep breath and he clarified that they were deceased. Amber looked completely shocked and immediately asked, "Is Damien dead too?" But Burns said, no, he's alive, but he's going to be kept in protective custody for a while in case whoever killed Jack and Linda try to hurt him too. And until they narrowed down the suspects, Damien would not be allowed to see anybody in the family, including her, his own mother. At this point, Amber just began to cry. Burns felt horrible for her, but really he was thinking about Damien. He knew he had to solve this case as quickly as possible because every day that he didn't would be another day that Damien would have to spend alone without any family to comfort him. Based both on Amber's reaction to the news and the fact that Damien did not mention seeing his mother on the night of the murder, Burns thought it was highly unlikely that Amber was a suspect, but she could know something that might help the investigation. So, once she calmed down, Burns asked her if she knew anyone who might have wanted to hurt her grandparents. And right away, she nodded, and she mentioned Damien's father, Andrew Huffman. She said Andrew hated Linda because she wouldn't let him see Damien. In fact, just recently, Andrew had come to Linda's pizza shop and started a fight with her about custody. And it had escalated to the point where Andrew had publicly threatened to kill her. This obviously caught Burns' attention because it made perfect sense as a motive. If Linda and Jack were out of the way, well, Andrew would have an easier time getting custody of Damien. And so he thanked Amber and promised he would be in touch soon. And then as soon as he was back in his car, he called Sergeant Whitaker and he told him what he'd learned. Later that day, Whitaker and his partner made the 2-hour drive to Andrew's address in Newport, Kentucky. When they got there, Andrew quickly came to the door and he let them inside and they sat down, and Andrew looked at them like, "What's going on?" And they told him that Linda and Jack had been murdered. And they watched Andrew for his reaction. And he seemed very surprised, but he definitely did not seem upset. Andrew would then admit that he did not get along with Amber's family. And when Whitaker asked him about that big argument at the pizza shop, Andrew did not deny that he had literally threatened to kill Linda. But he swore he would never actually do it. He said it was just an empty threat he made in the heat of the moment. Still, Whitaker thought Andrew looked very suspicious, so he asked him for an alibi. And Andrew said he'd stayed over at a girl's house on the night of the murder, and in the morning he'd stopped by his dad's house and then gone straight to work. And you could ask all those people, and that's where he was. Whitaker wrote all this down and then asked Andrew a few more questions, and then thanked him for his time. And then as soon as the detectives left, they immediately went to go check on Andrew's alibi. They went to that girl's house, then they went to Andrew's dad's house, and then they also went to his place of work, and everybody at those 3 locations all confirmed Andrew's alibi. So unless someone was lying, it left no window of time where Andrew could have driven 2 hours away to Ohio to murder Jack and Linda. Whitaker was disappointed that they'd basically wasted most of the day on this lead that now looked like it wouldn't go anywhere. Especially knowing that, again, every moment in this case that it went unsolved was another moment that Damien would have to spend away from his family all alone. The following morning, Detective Burns, the same officer who had spoken to Damien and also his mother Amber, sat inside of his office feeling very frustrated. He had one goal for the day. He wanted to interview Jack's estranged son, 28-year-old Travis Myers. But it was looking like that was going to be harder than he had anticipated. So the day before, a bunch of sheriff's deputies had interviewed Linda and Jack's family and friends. And family members in particular had mentioned that Travis and Jack had some bad blood. And when Burns had dug through the files on Travis, he found out that Travis also had a criminal record. But there was a problem. It appeared that Travis hadn't even been in Ohio in 7 years. The last anybody in the family had heard, he'd moved to Arizona to live with his mother. But when Burns had called the mother that morning, she said that she actually didn't know where Travis was at all. And there was no other address on record for Travis, so Burns basically had no idea where he was. And so he began to wonder, how was he going to track Travis down? And he decided he should start by visiting Travis's younger brother and Jack's other son, whose name was Greg. Burns knew Greg lived only a few towns over, and even though he really wasn't sure how close the brothers might be, it was the only lead he really had. A little while later, Burns showed up at Greg's house and he knocked on the front door. And a moment later, a young man in a baseball cap answered, and he looked very much like he'd been crying. Burns asked if he was Greg Myers, and the young man nodded and stepped aside to let him in. Greg did not seem remotely surprised by this visit. He said the police had already contacted him the night before to tell him about his father and stepmother's murder, and since then, he said he'd just been waiting for somebody to come by and talk to him, because he'd seen enough TV to know that family members were always the first suspects. But when they got into the living room, Burns stopped in his tracks because there was another young man standing in the doorway, and he looked a lot like Greg. Burns asked who it was, and Greg said, "Oh, that's my brother, Travis." Burns couldn't believe his luck. He'd come here hoping to figure out where Travis might be, but he never imagined he would just find Travis standing in Greg's house. And this was a big development, because really, until now, Burns had no idea if Travis was even in the state at the time of the murders. But Greg would actually tell him that Travis had been in Ohio for the past several weeks, staying in an apartment that he had rented right nearby. Burns did think the timing seemed very suspicious. It just seemed way too convenient that Travis had come back into town for the first time in almost a decade, right before Jack and Linda were killed. It just seemed too perfect. And also at this point, it just seemed really suspicious that these two brothers are just standing here waiting for police to come question them. Something felt off. So Burns, operating on a gut instinct, told them both that in order to question them, they actually had to come with him to the station and do it formally down there. Less than an hour later, Detective Burns opened the door of the Dark County Sheriff's Office and he showed Greg and Travis Myers inside. Now, neither of the brothers were under arrest yet, but Burns had a feeling that by the end of their interviews, one or both of them could be. Burns took Greg into his office for questioning, while Burns' partner took Travis into a room down the hall. As soon as Greg sat down in front of the desk, Burns noticed that he wasn't making eye contact with him. He was sort of acting shifty. But pretty quickly, Greg said he was perfectly willing to tell the detectives anything they wanted if it could help solve his dad and stepmother's murders. And so Burns immediately began asking questions. He asked Greg what he was doing in the early hours of Thursday morning when Jack and Linda were killed. And Greg told him that mostly he was just asleep. That is, until about 4:30 when he got up to go to his job at a factory that was a few towns over. He also said his girlfriend was at home with him the whole night and she could confirm that. He then said he drove to work in his minivan and he clocked in at 5:23 a.m. And he even had a signed time card back home that would prove it. And Burns was immediately very interested to learn that Greg drove a minivan. Because remember, that neighbor had said she saw a minivan leaving the Myers farm around 4:30 on the morning of the murders, suggesting the killer drove a minivan. However, Burns was starting to realize that even if Greg's alibi were shaky or didn't check out, the timing alone likely ruled him out. It basically was impossible to drive from Greg's house at 4:30 a.m. when he left, go all the way to the farm, commit the murders, then drive to the factory and be able to clock in at 5:23 a.m. when he had his time card stamped. That just wasn't enough time to do all that. And also, pretty much everybody in the family had told Burns that Greg was quite close with Jack and Linda. Now, he was having some problems with drugs and alcohol, but he had no history of crime or violence, and none of his family members thought he seemed capable of being a killer. So even though Greg remained a suspect, Burns decided he would shift his focus to Travis. So Burns asked Greg how had Travis reacted when he heard about Jack and Linda's murders. And he said Travis had been upset, but he'd mostly been concerned about how Greg was coping, because Greg was the one who was much closer to Jack and Linda. Travis was estranged. Greg went on to say that it had been at least 7 years since Travis and his father had spoken, and that those two did not get along at all. Burns asked Greg about that falling out between Jack and Travis, and Greg said it just came down to business disagreements on the farm. He said Travis had felt like his father was cheating him out of money, and they had this big argument that got really ugly, so Travis had just quit the business and moved away. Burns thought about this, and he wondered if maybe Travis stood to inherit any money if his father died. Because if so, that would definitely be a solid motive for murder. And so Burns made two mental notes. One was to look into Greg's alibi, and the other was to look into Jack's will to see how his assets were going to be divided up. After that, he thanked Greg for his cooperation, told him to wait in his office, and then Burns left. And he went right down the hall, and he waited outside the door while his partner finished questioning Travis. Burns' partner would say that Travis had seemed really nervous from the very moment he stepped inside the room. The detective had asked him what he was doing in Ohio, and Travis said he'd just been reevaluating his life recently. And he'd realized that he'd never actually met his brother Greg's children, so he'd come back to Ohio to do just that and spend some time with them. Then the detective asked him what he was doing when Jack and Linda were killed, and Travis stuttered out that he was sleeping in his apartment. The detective asked him if he had anybody who could confirm that, and Travis kind of hesitated and then shook his head and said no. Then the detective asked Travis if he had a car, and Travis said that at the moment he was driving his mother's car, a white minivan. After getting debriefed by his partner about this interview with Travis, Burns went back into his office. By this point, Greg had been moved out and put in a different room, and Burns sat down at his desk and he began going over the evidence they'd collected so far. Now, the investigation to this point had been moving really quickly, and so there actually wasn't a whole lot of evidence yet. In fact, it had only been 24 hours since the forensics were sent to the crime lab, so they were still waiting for results on pretty much everything. Burns knew that at this point, the best thing he could do while he waited for more evidence was go follow up on Travis and Greg's alibis. After all, they are the victims' children, and he already thought that the killer had to be connected personally to the victims, and they both drove minivans. So really, either of them could be the killer. But just then, Burns' phone rang. He picked it up, and it was a local man who said he had seen a news report about Jack and Linda's murders, and he had some information that just might help. The man said that a few days earlier, his friend had called him to see if he knew where they could buy a gun. And when this man who's talking to Burns, asked this friend why they needed the gun, the friend said it was because they, quote, wanted to shoot Jack Myers. The man told Burns the name of his friend who said this, and as soon as Burns heard that name, he knew exactly who his murderer was. Based on this phone call, as well as forensic evidence from the crime scene, this is what police believe happened to Jack and Linda Myers on the morning of March 27, 2003. Early on the morning of the murders, the killer woke up and got out of bed and right away put on a green hunting jumpsuit. And they also packed a bag with duct tape, trash bags, and a roll of masking tape. Then they put on a pair of latex gloves and loaded the 12-gauge shotgun that they had purchased from a classified ad 2 days earlier, and they carried all their supplies out to their minivan. After they were ready, they hopped in the driver's seat, turned on the car, and then drove a familiar route through the dark open fields. They were calm at first, until they turned onto the gravel road that led to Jack and Linda's farm. At that point, their heart began to race. Now, the killer felt like they had planned all of this out and prepared for anything that could go wrong. So now really all they had to do was just control themselves and just stick to the plan. And so the killer parked right outside the farmhouse, and then while staying in the car, they climbed into the back seat of the minivan and they grabbed their shotgun. Then they grabbed this thick quilting fabric and they wrapped it around the barrel of the shotgun and they used masking tape to secure it. That was their DIY silencer. But as they went through this plan, the killer's hands were shaking. They were nervous because as much as they had planned for this, it really was not something they actually wanted to do, but they felt like they had to. So after their gun had its silencer on it, they slung it over their shoulder, then they got out of the van and crept around to the side of the house. And once they were there, they cut the phone lines so nobody inside would be able to call for help. Then they knelt down in the dirt and they pried open the basement window and they climbed inside. Once inside, the killer walked to the stairs, they went up to the first floor, and they walked straight to the bedroom where they knew Jack and Linda would be asleep. They went inside, and there they were, sleeping in their beds, and the killer took a deep breath and then raised their shotgun, and they fired a single round into the back of Jack's neck. But the force of the gunshot had blasted off the homemade silencer, and so basically it wasn't silent at all. It was extremely loud, and that homemade silencer landed on the pillow right next to Jack's head. And almost immediately, from the chaos, Linda sat up and she looked straight at the killer and she saw what was happening and she just raised a hand to try to defend herself. And in a moment of panic, the killer just turned the shotgun on her and they fired twice. And one blast went through her hand and the other struck her right in the face. At this point, the killer just paused and waited. The silencer had sort of muffled the first shot, but the second two were so loud. They knew that noise easily could have woken up the third person who they knew was in this house, someone they really didn't want to hurt. But if they had to, they would. So, just to make sure they didn't have any loose ends, they left Linda and Jack's bedroom, confident they were dead, and they crept upstairs to little Damien's room. And they went inside, and they carefully walked over right next to the boy's bed, and they raised their shotgun and aimed it at this child, waiting to see if they were awake. But the little boy appeared to be asleep, and so the killer spared him. They lowered their shotgun and they walked out of the room. Once they were out in the hallway, they shut Damien's door and then hurried right out of the house. And from there, they got back in their minivan and they sped off. A few miles away, they stopped on a bridge and tossed their gun, their supplies, and their clothes into a river, and then they changed into their work clothes and they drove to the factory, where they would clock in at precisely 5:23 a.m. The killer was Jack's younger son, Greg Myers. Greg had been having problems with money and drug abuse, and his father, Jack, had refused to help him, and they were fighting about it. But Greg knew he would inherit the farm if his father died, and he was so desperate, he decided murder was his best option. When police timed the drive from Jack and Linda's farm to Greg's workplace, they found that he would have actually had just enough time to commit the horrible double murder and then drive straight to work and clock in by 5:23. Greg was ultimately arrested about 48 hours after the crime, so quickly that police were actually still gathering evidence to use against him. They later found the gun, other supplies, and shoes that matched the prints found outside the house in a river right near the farm. And fingerprints and receipts tied all the items back to Greg. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. As for Damien, following the murders, he would go to live with his mother Amber. Despite everything he witnessed at just 4 years old, Amber said in a 2021 documentary that he is now doing very well. On the evening of April 7, 1990, 25-year-old Nancy Langert looked at the cardboard boxes stacked up in the living room of her home in Winnetka, Illinois, trying to figure out what else she still had to pack. She and her husband Richard were moving at the end of the month, and Nancy could not wait. She was almost 3 months pregnant, and the new house had a lot more space, including a room for the baby's nursery. But as Nancy scanned the room, she realized there really wasn't much left for her to do. Other than the boxes, the only things in the room were a TV, a stereo, a card table, and some folding chairs. The truth was that even though she and Richard had been staying in this small townhouse for months that was owned actually by her parents, they had never actually really settled in. It always felt like it was a temporary place to sort their finances out, after Richard had racked up some serious gambling debt. As soon as the thought of Richard's gambling crossed her mind, Nancy shook her head and then called for her little dog, Pepsi. She heard his nails clicking across the floor, and she picked him up and scratched under his chin, trying to take her mind off of Richard's gambling and their money issues. But it was no use. It was all she could think about. Both Nancy and Richard had good jobs working at a growing coffee company, but Richard had always liked to bet on sports. And at some point, he had started spending more than he earned and began also borrowing money from friends to keep up with his gambling. It had all come to a head months earlier when Nancy and Richard fell behind on bills and had to move into this townhouse owned by Nancy's parents. And then Nancy's mother had to create a budget for them and put them on a weekly allowance, which was very embarrassing for both of them. But recently, things had gotten a lot better. They'd paid down their debt, built up their savings again, and now they were about to move out of this temporary home. In fact, at this very moment, Nancy even had $500 in cash in her purse to deposit into her bank account. Nancy gave Pepsi a kiss and put him down on the floor, and she reminded herself to stay positive. Richard was trying hard to curb his spending, and other than his gambling issue, he really was a great husband. And Richard and Nancy had both wanted a baby for so long, and now it was finally happening, and she knew Richard was going to be an amazing father. Feeling better, Nancy sat down on a folding chair and flipped on the TV. At around 6:30 p.m., the phone rang. It was Richard, telling Nancy he was leaving work and he'd be home to pick her up in just a few minutes. They were celebrating Nancy's father's 60th birthday that night. They had an 8 p.m. dinner reservation, but they were picking up Nancy's parents and sister at her sister's place first. Nancy turned off the TV, picked up Pepsi, and took him upstairs to the bedroom so he wouldn't chew up any of the cardboard boxes while they were gone. After putting him inside, she shut the door gently, walked back downstairs, threw on a coat, and walked outside to Richard's car, shivering in the early spring chill. A few minutes later, Nancy's sister, Jean, opened the door to her apartment with a huge smile on her face. She led Nancy and Richard inside, and then she handed Nancy 2 beautifully wrapped presents that she'd brought back from a recent trip to Ireland. Nancy opened up the first gift and found a gorgeous Irish wool sweater inside. But the other present made Nancy feel like she might cry from happiness. It was a little onesie and booties for a newborn baby. Nancy thanked Jean repeatedly and gave her a big hug. She was so happy. At around 8 p.m., the group got to the restaurant, and Nancy was happily surprised to see that none of her parents' friends were meeting them there. The celebration would now just be with family. It wasn't that Nancy didn't like her parents' friends, though. Some of them had been around for so long that they actually felt like her own family. Like her dad's work friend, Nick Biro, and his wife Joan, who she had totally expected to be there. But then there was this guy, Victor, who was one of her father's closest friends, but he was also rumored to be in the mob. Nancy didn't mind Victor, but Richard could not stand him. So his absence from the party was a relief. As the food started to arrive to their table, Nancy suddenly didn't feel well. Her pregnancy was giving her really bad nausea, and the smell of pasta and steak just set it off. But she didn't want to ruin the night for everyone, so she tried to hide the fact that she really just wanted to go throw up. However, she could see her mom looking over at her with a raised eyebrow from across the table, and Nancy forced a smile back. She knew she was not convincing her mother that she was doing okay, but her mother just went back to her lasagna without saying anything, in fear she might embarrass her daughter. After dinner, Nancy and the rest of her family all piled back into Richard's car so he could drive everybody home. He dropped Nancy's sister Jean off first, and when she got out, Jean gave Nancy a big hug and told her she would see her tomorrow at church. Then Richard dropped off Nancy's parents. However, Nancy's mother paused before getting out of the car. She said she noticed at dinner that Nancy was feeling sick and asked if maybe Nancy and Richard wanted to spend the night there, at her house. For a second, Nancy did consider it. Having your parents around if you're feeling sick is kind of like what everybody wants. But Richard was supposed to dog sit for a neighbor, and she wanted to sleep in her own bed, cuddled up with Pepsi, so she ultimately said, no thank you. Her parents then said goodnight, and then they walked into their house. On the drive back home, Richard and Nancy planned out the rest of their evening. Richard would walk the neighbor's dog, and then actually sleep over at the neighbor's house to keep the dog company. But first, Nancy and Richard would take their dog, Pepsi, for a walk together. They pulled up to their townhouse, and Richard walked around the car, opened up Nancy's door, and helped her outside. They smiled at each other, and he asked her how she was feeling, and Nancy said she still felt nauseous, but she was too happy about everything to let it bother her. Richard gave Nancy's shoulder a quick squeeze, and then they walked inside together. At 7 a.m. the next morning, Nancy's mother called her daughter to see if she was feeling any better. But Nancy didn't pick up, so her mom figured she must be sleeping in and hung up without leaving a message. She knew she would just see her daughter later at church anyway. However, when Nancy's mother got to church that day and took her seat in their regular pew, the bench beside her stayed empty for the entire service. Nancy's mom worried the entire time, so as soon as she got back home, she called her daughter again. And when Nancy still didn't answer, Nancy's father said he was going over to the townhouse to make sure everything was okay. Nancy's dad got to the townhouse just a few minutes later. He figured Nancy was just sick and sleeping, so he wasn't actually all that worried. He rang the bell, but nobody answered, so he took out his own key, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The place felt oddly quiet, and no one responded when he called out. Then Nancy's dad saw his daughter's purse lying on the floor, surrounded by cash and credit cards, and so now he was worried. Suddenly, he heard a noise upstairs. It sounded like scratching on a door. So he ran out of the room, took the steps up 2 at a time, and then headed down the second-floor hallway to Nancy's bedroom, where the scratching sound was coming from. There, he opened up the door, and the little dog Pepsi came running out, and the stench of urine immediately hit Nancy's dad. Now he was really starting to panic. He knew his daughter would never lock her precious dog in a room long enough for the dog to have to urinate all over the ground. He turned and ran back downstairs, now screaming his daughter's name, but still he didn't get an answer. He knew there was only one place he hadn't checked yet, the basement. Nancy's father ran to the top of the basement stairs. The basement light was on, but all he could see when he looked downstairs were shadowy shapes below, which he assumed must be their moving boxes. But as he slowly walked down the stairs and the shapes came into view, he gasped. They weren't boxes. They were the bodies of his pregnant daughter and his son-in-law. They were both covered in blood. Nancy was still wearing her clothes from the night before, and her eyes were wide open. For a moment, Nancy's father simply froze, unable to process what he was seeing. Then he leapt down the remaining stairs to his daughter's side and grabbed her hand, but it was freezing cold. He sprinted back up the stairs and he dialed 911. Winnetka Police Sergeant Gene Calvados woke up to the sound of his wife's voice calling him from the other room. He blinked at his clock, which read 6:40 p.m. He'd worked overnight and hadn't gotten to bed until about midday, and now his wife was saying he had yet another phone call from headquarters. All Sergeant Calvados wanted was just to go back to sleep, but he forced himself to get up and go to the phone because this was his job. And as soon as he heard his lieutenant's voice in the phone, Calvados snapped wide awake. The lieutenant said there had been a double homicide, and Calvados needed to get to the scene right now. A few minutes later, Sergeant Calvados parked his car outside of Nancy and Richard's townhouse. Calvados had seen plenty of violent deaths in his life. Before he became a police officer, he had served in Vietnam, and he had watched other young men in his unit grow hardened to bloodshed and violence, but Calvados really never got used to it. In fact, Calvados could see the face of every dead person he'd ever seen as clearly as if they were still right in front of him. And now he braced himself for the faces he was about to see in that basement. Sergeant Calvados stepped out of his car, and he saw several officers speaking to Nancy's father outside the house. Calvados quickly introduced himself and then headed inside, where a forensics team was already combing through the townhouse. One of the forensics officers came over to Calvados. He said the double homicide had taken place in the basement, but before Calvados went downstairs, he wanted to show the detective 3 pieces of evidence they'd found on the first floor. The forensics officer pointed to the ground just a few feet away, and Calvados noticed Nancy's purse lying there with $500 in cash and several credit cards lying next to it. Calvados quickly noticed there was still a TV and a high-end stereo in the room, so it seemed unlikely that what they were dealing with here was a robbery gone bad. Then the forensics officer led Calvados towards a door that opened onto a small back patio. Calvados saw a perfectly cut square piece of glass, which had been removed from the door and placed on the floor inside. And the forensics officer pointed out something interesting. The door was still locked. So whoever cut the glass did not reach through the hole and unlock the door, which would have been easy. Instead, they literally climbed through the small hole in the door, which would have taken far more time and effort. Finally, the forensics officer took Calvados over to a small card table that was next to a moving box. The officer said it looked like someone had rifled through the box and put a single item from it on the table. Calvados leaned in, and a look of surprise came across his face. The item on the table was Nancy and Richard's marriage license. But the forensics officer said he didn't know yet if the person who broke in had put the license there or if maybe it just happened to be there already. Calvados thanked the officer, and then after taking a deep breath, he headed to the basement, hoping things would start to get a bit clearer down there. Calvados walked down the steps slowly, and as the scene came into view, he couldn't help but wince. Richard had been handcuffed and shot in the back of the head. It looked like he had probably died instantly. Nancy, though, was not handcuffed, and her death had clearly been slow. She was shot twice in her side and in her abdomen, and there was blood smeared all around her body, like she had crawled or rolled in the blood after being wounded, and her eyes were still open, frozen in her final moment. Calvados also saw an axe on the floor between Richard and Nancy, and he wondered how that figured into the crime if the killer had a gun. Had the couple tried to fight back with it? He didn't know. Then something else caught Sergeant Calvados' attention. On a moving box between the bodies, a small heart and the letter U were scrawled in blood. Calvados crouched down and saw blood on one of Nancy's fingertips, so he wondered if she had left this message or if the killer had staged it to look that way. Regardless of the answer, Calvados realized whoever killed Nancy and Richard had not acted in the heat of the moment. The handcuffs and the execution-style shooting of Richard proved that. And that execution-style shooting made Calvados wonder if the murders had been carried out by a professional hitman. The cut glass in the patio door could also support that theory because it suggested a very high level of planning. But Calvados stood there and just shook his head, like he was arguing with himself. Removing the glass in the door seemed like something a professional would do, but then why would the professional killer squeeze through the small hole in the door instead of just reaching in and unlocking the door? Also, Richard's murder seemed like a cold-blooded, very efficient assassination, whereas Nancy's murder seemed sloppy. She clearly lived long enough to roll or crawl through the blood on the floor, and she might have lived long enough to even write that message on the moving box. So in a way, Calvados felt like he was almost looking at two different crime scenes at once, one crime scene for Richard and one crime scene for Nancy. Calvados suddenly felt a tap on his shoulder. It was one of the officers who'd been talking to Nancy's dad. The officer told Calvados he had very important information. Nancy had been pregnant. Calvados' heart sank. He knew the look on Nancy's face would stay with him for a very long time. Later that day, as officers met with Nancy and Richard's neighbors, the chief of police decided to form a task force to investigate the double murder. He said he would ask for help from detectives from surrounding suburbs, but he wanted Sergeant Calvados to lead the team. Calvados knew this was going to be the biggest challenge of his career. A double homicide of a young couple that was potentially carried out by a professional hitman was a whole different level of crime than he'd ever seen in Winnetka. The next day, Sergeant Calvados knocked on the door of Nancy's parents' house. Nancy's dad opened the door, and Calvados could tell from his puffy eyes that he'd been crying. As gently as he could, Calvados asked the father if he could get Nancy and Richard's wedding albums and address books, or anything that could help him identify all of their friends and acquaintances. Nancy's father just nodded, looking shell-shocked, and invited the sergeant to come inside while he looked. Calvados stepped inside and then sat down on the couch, and Nancy's mother came in. She also had a vacant stare on her face, almost like she literally couldn't process what had happened. Still, almost on autopilot, she politely offered him some coffee, which Calvados said no thank you to. Then, Calvados told her that he was the one leading this investigation, and he really needed her to think as hard as she could about all the people in her daughter's life. Did she know anyone who might want to hurt Nancy or Richard? But Nancy's mother shook her head and said no. And as Nancy's father came in with the things the sergeant had asked for, he also said the same thing. Nancy and Richard were wonderful people with a big supportive group of friends. The idea that either of them had enemies seemed kind of ridiculous. On Tuesday, April 10th, so 3 days after the murders, Nancy and Richard's bosses at the coffee company offered a $10,000 reward for information in the case, and also Nancy's parents matched it. And so tips about Nancy and Richard began to pour in. Phones at police headquarters rang constantly, and before long, the task force was totally inundated. And as Sergeant Calvados sifted through all this new information they were getting, a new and much more complicated picture of the murdered couple began to emerge. A few tipsters alerted the sergeant to Richard's gambling debts, and the fact that he very likely owed people money because of his gambling problem. This was a major red flag to Calvados, but the debts themselves actually seemed way too small to be worth killing 2 people over. However, the tips about Nancy were more promising. Apparently, she had had an affair for more than a year, and her former lover had left town for Georgia just 2 days after the murders. This, combined with the marriage contract left on the table at the crime scene, made Calvados wonder if the killings were retaliation from Nancy's ex-lover for breaking the affair off. Calvados sent detectives down to Georgia to speak with Nancy's former lover, but the man said the affair was far more emotional than physical. Nancy mostly just wanted someone to talk to because Richard was working 2 jobs and she was just kind of lonely. But when Richard got his full-time job at the coffee company, the couple had totally reconciled and they got back to normal. And so this ex-lover said at that point, he also had been ready to move on. And so even though the move to Georgia came so close to the murders, it had actually been planned out for weeks. Calvados wasn't quite prepared to rule this man out quite yet, but he was already finding this case very frustrating. Everything from the conflicting evidence at the crime scene where, one murder is well planned and the other seems sloppy, and, the glass, why did you climb through and not unlock it by reaching through, to the contradictory stories about the victims, seemed to pull him in very different directions. Meanwhile, rumors of hitmen and criminal syndicates began flying all over town. There was a bike path that ran behind Nancy and Richard's house, leading basically all the way to Chicago, and residents became convinced that a Chicago mobster must have been the killer, and they must have used that path to travel in and out sight unseen. Calvados did not necessarily buy that, but he got a tip that a close friend of Nancy's father, a man named Victor, supposedly had ties to the mafia. So Calvados began digging. However, he struggled to find anything useful. At least on the surface, Victor looked like an upstanding businessman. So Calvados was not any closer to nailing down a primary suspect. Four days after the murders, a massive crowd of 800 people from the area gathered for Nancy and Richard's funeral. The community really came out in force, to the point where random local groups like the high school's Peace Alliance Club and the track team were waiting in these long lines after the service just to offer their condolences to Nancy and Richard's family. Their deaths really took a toll on this town. Sergeant Calvados and some other detectives also went to the funeral, but mostly just to look for anybody who seemed nervous or excited or maybe overly dramatic. But all they found was a large group of people trying desperately to understand how something this horrible could have happened. After the funeral, Calvados went back to the station. He was on his way to his office when a lieutenant stopped him to tell him that somebody was there to see him. The lieutenant took Calvados to a very nervous-looking couple who said they had a tip about Nancy's sister, Jean. Jean was a lawyer, and she was heavily involved in political issues in Ireland. At that time, Ireland was in the midst of a violent period known as the Troubles. The Troubles were clashes between Protestants and Catholics over control of Northern Ireland, and there were regular shootings, car bombings, murders, and kidnappings. And Jean was not neutral. She provided legal aid to members of the Irish Republican Army, or IRA, which was the Catholic organization blamed for many acts of violence. The couple also told Sergeant Calvados that Jean had received a threat that if she returned to Ireland, she would be injured or maybe even killed. But despite that threat, Jean had gone back to Ireland very recently, and when she had arrived home, she showed up with gifts for Nancy and the baby just 3 days before the murders. The sergeant listened quietly, but inside, he was practically jumping out of his skin. This was the best lead he'd gotten so far. Maybe, he thought, somebody was hired to kill Jean, but killed Nancy and her husband by mistake. Or maybe they killed Nancy on purpose just to hurt Jean. It was not unheard of during the Troubles for innocent family members to be targeted for political revenge. And so, after speaking to this couple, Calvados got on the phone and called Jean into the station. Later that day, Calvados sat down across a table in a small interview room with Jean, and he could tell right away she was completely unlike any suspect he'd ever questioned before. Jean was unusually confident for somebody who was about to be questioned by a homicide detective. She sat up perfectly straight and calmly looked Calvados right in the eyes, without fidgeting or tapping her fingers or shifting around in her seat. Calvados asked Jean some basic questions about her job, and she was quite helpful. But then, the sergeant mentioned the threat that had been made on her life because of her work in Ireland, and also this theory that maybe a hired killer took out Nancy either by mistake or for revenge. At this point, Jean's demeanor totally changed. She went from cool and collected to sharp and visibly angry. She said it was ridiculous to imagine a gunman could confuse Nancy for her. They looked nothing alike. And the idea that someone would kill Nancy to get back at Jean was even more outrageous. Jean insisted that her job in Ireland was mostly human rights work and not worth killing her over, let alone her sister. Jean leaned forward and looked Calvados dead in the eyes and told him he was really stretching with that theory. Calvados was genuinely surprised. This was not what he was expecting, and he wasn't sure if Jean's reaction was fueled by righteous indignation at questions she truly considered unfair, or anxiety and guilt at the idea that she might have played a role in putting her sister at risk. But the sergeant pressed on, and he asked Jean for the names of every person she had visited the last time she was in Ireland, along with all of her work associates there. Jean turned red and yelled at the sergeant that none of this had anything to do with her sister's murder. She said Calvados was not getting anything from her, and then she stood up and stormed out of the interview room. Sergeant Calvados just sat there, both really surprised and really mad. This death threat on Jean was the first real lead they had, and he couldn't fully investigate it without the names from Jean. He had expected her to be grateful and to immediately offer up anything she knew to try to figure out who killed her sister. And so he just couldn't believe Jean was unwilling to help him, unless, of course, she was involved. Without any information from Jean about the death threat, Calvados was left chasing other possibilities that frankly just seemed increasingly unlikely. Both Richard and Nancy had worked for a coffee company that imported their beans from Colombia, which Calvados and basically everybody knew was a major importer of cocaine. He knew that drug cartels sometimes hid cocaine in coffee shipments. In fact, just 3 months before the murders, federal agents had seized 5 kilograms of cocaine in a coffee shipment from a different coffee company. So Calvados started poking around into the coffee company, looking for any ties to cartels. But the owners of the company seemed mostly puzzled by this, and they gave Calvados permission to inspect their next shipment. Like, they didn't care at all. Look at whatever you want. And so Calvados did that, flagging the ship that had their coffee on it to U.S. Customs officers, who then met the vessel when it came into port. A giant crane lifted the container with their coffee out of the ship and onto the dock, and then Customs officer cracked it open. Then they began slicing through random bags of beans to see if their drug-sniffing German shepherds could pick up a scent. But, like Calvados had feared, they found nothing. The police began to feel like they were just grasping at straws, and so they decided they should just go back to the beginning and kind of start over. So they re-interviewed all the neighbors, and they got one tantalizing tip about a mysterious man walking around the neighborhood the night of the murders, but after looking into it, they discovered it was actually just a bored teenager who lived nearby. After that, they looked into whether Richard and Nancy had maybe taken a loan from mobsters to lease their new place, but when they looked at the couple's tax records, they saw they could easily afford the rent. And so, once again, one after another, all the tips and leads they were finding just went nowhere. Calvados still had suspicions that Jean's ties to the IRA got her sister killed, but without Jean's cooperation, he struggled to make any headway on that lead. So, by the end of May, Sergeant Calvados was basically out of ideas as his big case rapidly went cold. Finally, on May 30th, so about a month after the murders, the police chief pulled Calvados into his office. From the look on Chief's face, Calvados knew the news was not good, but he could not have guessed what was coming next. The chief told him they were going to dismantle the task force. They had spent a whopping $1 million on this investigation so far and still had not come up with a serious single suspect. Calvados was shocked. This felt way too early to basically give up. But the chief wasn't done. In addition to dismantling the task force, he wanted Calvados back on the beat while another investigator stepped in and took a look at this case. The chief followed up and told Calvados that he was not taking him off the case completely, he just wanted a set of fresh eyes on it. But as Calvados nodded and turned to walk out of the office, it definitely felt like he had failed and he was being removed. Sergeant Calvados walked slowly towards his team to break the bad news, at the same time feeling totally sick and angry at the thought of patrolling the neighborhood again with everything in this case still completely up in the air. But a few days later, sure enough, Calvados was back in his blue uniform, driving a police cruiser around Winnetka. He figured his days as a detective were likely over. 6 months passed with no progress at all in the Langert case. Sergeant Calvados focused on working his beat, but at the same time, he just felt so distracted because all he felt was regret that he had not been able to find the killer. But then, on October 4th, Sergeant Calvados was home sleeping when his wife woke him up telling him that work was calling, just like she had done on the day of the murder. But this time, when he picked the phone up, his lieutenant was yelling excitedly that there had been a break in Nancy and Richard's case, and Calvados had to get down to the station right now. Calvados was so excited, he rushed out of bed, he jumped into his car, and he sped to the station. But when he got there, he found the supposed break was just a kid, and not a very tough-looking kid either. It was a skinny high school senior who had arrived at the station with his girlfriend for moral support, asking about the witness protection program. Calvados had to keep himself from rolling his eyes. He wondered what this kid could possibly know about a brutal double homicide. And at first, when the kid began talking, his story, predictably, sounded unbelievable. The kid said he somehow knew the killer, and the killer had supposedly confessed everything to him in unbelievable detail. But as he began walking Calvados and the other detectives through what he knew, Calvados realized this kid was telling the truth. The teenager knew details of the crime that had never been made public, like how many shots were fired and the fact that the marriage contract was on the table. But beyond individual details, the teenager's story explained all the strange contradictions that Calvados had struggled with since the beginning of the case. Richard was killed quickly and efficiently, but Nancy's murder was messy and slow. The killer had apparently brought a gun along, but someone had grabbed an axe that wasn't entirely clear, and then the killer had used glass-cutting tools to get inside, but then needlessly crawled through the tiny hole in the door instead of just reaching through and unlocking it. And so all these things definitely lined up with what Calvados had suspected. Calvados had never been able to figure out if the killer was a professional hitman or a sloppy amateur, but now, as the sergeant listened to this kid talk, it seemed like the killer might have been a little bit of both. After speaking to this kid and looking at all the evidence in the case and looking at all their interviews, here is a reconstruction of what police think happened on the night of Saturday, April 7th, 1990, when Nancy and Richard were murdered inside of their home. The killer arrived at Nancy and Richard's townhouse while the couple was out to dinner. The killer had been preparing for this moment for months. They approached the patio door from the path that ran behind the house. They didn't even bother trying the doorknob. Instead, they pulled out a glass cutter to remove a section of the sliding patio doors. And then once the cuts were made, they stuck some very sticky tape to the front of the glass piece and then pulled it out silently, just like they had been practicing. Then, once it was out, instead of reaching through and opening the door, the killer crawled into the house through the hole and then waited. But they had no idea how long it would be before Nancy and Richard came home, and as the minutes turned to hours, the killer began to get restless. And so they just started wandering around the house sort of aimlessly, rifling through random boxes that were sitting around. And it was there that the killer found Nancy and Richard's marriage contract. They began to read it, but it was mostly legal jargon, so they just placed it on the card table near the box they dug it out of. But the longer the killer waited for Nancy and Richard to come home, the more impatient they got, and the more nervous. And so they ultimately just turned on a light and then sat on a chair in the shadows with their gun on their lap. They had a hood pulled down low, but they thought the light shining from behind them would help hide their face even more. Then finally, sometime after 11 p.m., the killer heard voices and then the key in the door. Nancy and Richard walked inside, but they were so caught up in their conversation, they didn't even notice the killer sitting there. But then the killer spoke and told them to be quiet and closed the door behind them. The killer could instantly see how startled Nancy and Richard were. The killer then raised their gun, and Nancy and Richard's surprise quickly turned to fear. The killer loved it. The killer demanded Nancy hand over her purse. She said she didn't have any money, but the killer demanded the purse again, and so Nancy threw it to the killer, and everything inside of it fell out onto the floor, including the stack of cash totaling $500. Nancy started stammering that she'd forgotten about the money, and Richard urged the killer to just please take the cash and go. She wasn't trying to lie to you. But the killer, who acted totally offended at the idea that they were hiding things from him, was not actually here for their money. They didn't care. The killer, still aiming their gun at Nancy and Richard, reached into their pocket to pull out handcuffs. But as they fished around in their pocket, they began to curse. In their excitement about this night, they'd only brought one pair of handcuffs, not the two they actually needed. But Richard was clearly the bigger threat. He was a tall, athletic guy, so the killer gave the cuffs to Nancy and told her to handcuff her husband. As Nancy handcuffed Richard's hands behind his back, she began to plead with the killer. "Please don't hurt us. I'm pregnant." Something about Nancy's plea hit the killer hard, and they could feel their hands begin to shake. Suddenly there was a noise upstairs, and the killer accidentally pulled the trigger, shooting a bullet into the baseboards. But the killer quickly realized that the noise was just the dog, closed in the upstairs bedroom, barking at something. Still, the killer felt like their plan was now quickly falling apart. Things were already going so wrong. The killer started to lose their nerve, and they thought about sparing Nancy and Richard. So the killer told the couple to go to the basement, and then once they were down there, the killer would lock the door and just leave. And so the killer directed Nancy and Richard to the basement stairs at gunpoint, and no one said a word. But as Nancy and Richard descended the stairs and then reached the bottom of the stairs, Nancy suddenly turned around and looked at the killer. And the killer knew from her surprised look on her face that she had seen the killer's face. The light was better down there, and the hood did not disguise the killer enough. The killer knew Nancy would be able to identify them. And so now the killer had a choice to make. Let them live and face the consequences, or follow through with the plan. But before the killer could decide, Richard made a desperate move. With all his strength, he snapped the cheap handcuffs, jumped at the killer, and smashed his own head against the killer's head. Almost instinctively, the killer just fired the gun, and it hit Richard right in the back of his head. Richard crumpled to the floor. Nancy rushed to his side, screaming, then looked back at the killer, whose gun was still raised. Nancy shouted, "Not again, no!" and covered her face as the killer took a shot at her. The killer turned and ran up the stairs, but as they got to the top, they looked back. Nancy was still alive and moving. The bullet had only hit her in the elbow. The killer knew at this point they had already come this far, they had to go back. So the killer raised their gun again and pulled the trigger one more time. The bullet hit Nancy and lodged in her pregnant stomach. She collapsed to the floor, and the killer turned and ran out of the basement. But after the killer left, Nancy was still alive. Barely. She tried to climb up the stairs, but it was a struggle. The coat she was wearing was quickly filling with blood, weighing her down. And so with an enormous effort, she managed to pull off her jacket, but as she looked up the stairs, she knew it was just too much. She would never get up there. So, Nancy turned and dragged herself over to the basement shelves and grabbed the nearest thing she could reach, the axe. And then with the axe, she banged on the shelf, hoping that the noise would get somebody's attention, but nobody came to the rescue. And so with her last bit of strength, Nancy dropped the axe, dipped her finger in her own blood, dragged herself over to a moving box on the floor, and drew a heart and the letter U. She looked at Richard, hoping maybe there was a small chance he would live and see her final message. "I love you." And then Nancy took her final breath. When the police began investigating this case, they knew that some of the evidence suggested the killer was an amateur, but most of their leads pointed to a professional hitman, which is why Calvados and his team had been so interested in the mob and in drugs and the IRA. It was a mistake that allowed one person to escape any attention at all, because the killer was right there, hanging around the investigation in plain sight the entire time. He was one of the members of the High School Peace Alliance Club who came to the funeral. He was on the track team too, so he ran past the Langert's house almost every single day. The police had even questioned him, because he was also the teenage boy who had been seen in the neighborhood on the night of the murders, but had quickly been written off. But it turned out that kid, the 16-year-old named David Biro, was the killer. And he also happened to be the son of Nancy's family friends, Nick and Joan Biro, who Nancy had thought might be at her father's birthday party on the night that she was killed. It would turn out 16-year-old David had serious psychological issues, and he had become obsessed with becoming a hitman after seeing the 1980s movie, Bestseller, about a hitman who wanted to turn his story into a book. The idea of killing people excited David, and he had actually already tried to do it at least once before. Prior to the murders, David's parents had him committed to a psychiatric hospital after he tried to poison his own family. But after only 2 months, his parents had let him come home against the recommendation of his doctors. And once he was home, teenager David Biro chose to live out his hitman fantasy by killing Nancy and Richard. And his reason for targeting Nancy and Richard had nothing to do with their connections to his family. Instead, he chose them as his murder victims because their townhouse was conveniently located, and he also found them, quote, annoying. David might have gotten away with these murders, but as the months went by and the police never came for him, he got cocky, and he began to brag to a friend about what he had done. He even showed his friend the glass that he'd practiced his glass cutting on, and he also showed him the murder weapon. And David's friend pretty much immediately turned him in because he was very worried David would kill again. And so on October 5th, 1990, almost 6 months to the day after Nancy and Richard were gunned down, David was arrested. It was the day before Nancy's baby would have been due. David was sentenced to life in prison for killing Nancy, Richard, and their unborn child. Nancy's parents would move back into Nancy and Richard's townhouse shortly after the murders as a way to feel closer to Nancy and Richard.
We are the silent architects, building dreams the world neglects. Layered stones of hope and fear, raised by hands they never hear. Silent architects, shaping futures from the wrecks, lifting ruins into life.
Blue light fading in my room, 2 a.m. still waiting on you. Last thing I said still says delivered. Guess silence hits harder than truth. Your name still lights up my phone, but nothing ever comes through. You're everywhere but here with me, and I don't know what to do. No fight, no words, no sign, no we're done, no last line. You didn't walk away from me, you just disappeared in time. You left me on red, not goodbye, no reason, no warning sign. Just quiet nights and question marks where your voice used to lie. You didn't break my heart out loud, you just slowly shut me out. You left me on red and so
Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. They are this one, of course, Mr. Ballin Podcast, and we also have Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, we have Bedtime Stories, and also Run Fool.